So, Richard, thanks for joining. It's actually been good to see your name pop up again recently in various podcasts and media reports because I feel as though we've otherwise had little objective analysis on what's been happening since the end of last year's war. So, I think that's a good place to start. While I understand that there are still many questions and possibly some confusion still, where do you now think Armenia and Azerbaijan are in terms of any progress towards resolving the conflict over Nagorno Karabakh?
Well, there are three significant aspects in terms of assessing where we are and where we're going. The first is looking back. Armenia is now approaching a 1 year anniversary since the end of the war for Nagorno Karabakh. For much of those 12 months, I would argue the Armenian government and much of the population has been has been limited to a state of denial where it took many, many months in order to accept a new reality. The second observation here is we know little in terms of transparency and concrete information of the return to diplomacy, as well as the outlook for regional trade and transportation. But the third element here is there is a rare degree of good news. I would say the turning point came on September 24th on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly when the Armenian Azerbaijani foreign ministers and the Minsk group mediators were able to reconvene in a meeting that heralded the return and resumption of diplomacy over the force of arms. And I would say if that was the turning point, the tipping point was an end to intransigence by Azerbaijan. And now we do see that we are on the verge of a return to the region by the OSCE Minsk group, including a planned visit to Nagorno Karabakh. And second, a preliminary announcement regarding a breakthrough agreement on regional trade and transport. Beyond that, there's many more questions than answers, but I do think this does mark an important breakthrough in terms of a return to diplomacy and a belated Armenian adjustment to a painful, unprecedented new reality.
I was going to actually say that you have sounded cautiously optimistic in other interviews and panels that I've listened to or watched. You're even sounding, dare I say it, somewhat positive. And we've also had word of maybe there's a chance for normalization of Armenia-Turkey relations. I guess that the big question, though, that everyone has is this genuine? To what extent are all these processes interlinked? Because, we've had Erdogan imply that if Armenia does something towards Azerbaijan, then Turkey will do something towards Armenia. And even though Hikmet Hajiev the other day was actually quoted as saying that this should be an issue for Armenia and Turkey only. So, I mean, how would you view this?
Well, I would say yes, there is a degree of justifiable optimism. This is not necessarily a result or an achievement of Armenian diplomacy, but more a reflection of the intersection between Russia and Azerbaijan's newfound position. And if we look at it more closely, we do see a role reversal. In other words, Azerbaijan today, post war Azerbaijan, has assumed the traditional role that Armenia used to have in terms of perhaps overconfidence with the status quo. Armenia, in contrast, has assumed the frustration and weakness and unpredictability of what used to define Azerbaijan's position. Against that backdrop, we see two developments. The acceptance of the Russian imposed ceasefire agreement is not only thing that halted the war for Nagorno Karabakh, it's the only guarantee of the security and safety of the Armenians that remain in what's left of Nagorno Karabakh. For the Armenians of Karabakh, they're increasingly looking to Moscow and not Yerevan for their future. At the same time, Much of the breakthrough and the optimism is related to the bilateral relationships between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Armenia and Turkey, not Nagorno Karabakh, which is an important distinction. But we do see, in many ways, Azerbaijan was in an isolated position with the border incursions, border tension, and I do think there was a calculation in Baku that it could no longer continue to defy Russia and to test the patience of the Kremlin. But Aliyev did a very good job at calling the bluff of the Kremlin and actually maintaining momentum and initiative on the ground despite the Russian presence. And for Armenia Turkey, I really think Turkey was in a losing position by the end of the war. In other words, at the beginning of the war, Turkey provided unprecedented direct military support for Azerbaijan. But at the end of the war, it was Russia that came in with a unilateral deployment of peacekeepers and swept the geopolitical prize. Turkey has much less than expected in any kind of post war peacekeeping role, and Turkey was excluded from the working group on trade and transport between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia. And I think for Turkey, normalization with Armenia is a way to regain a seat at the table in terms of the all important regional trade and transport dynamic. And secondly, for Turkey, it no longer has the political cover or justification for not normalizing relations, given the change in the landscape in the post war environment, meaning that for Turkey, this could be an inevitable process. And finally, for Armenia, Armenia Turkey normalization may actually be a deal cut between Moscow and Ankara. Armenia will have to struggle to make sure that the implementation of normalization is on its terms rather than externally between Russia and Turkey. And Armenia is still in a position of weakness, not strength. So I really think, although we do see justifiable optimism, return to diplomacy, the beginning of a normalization or return to normalcy, I think the longer term verdict remains a question.
So I'd like to speak a little bit more about Nagorno Karabakh security towards the end, but thank you for raising that. But with regards to a possible breakthrough, I mean, Tatul Hagopian pretty much dropped a bombshell recently by suggesting that two documents could be signed in Moscow next month. We knew something was happening. Sometimes we had snippets of information. Other times, there was gossip. I guess we shouldn't listen to it, but some of it turned out to be true. It hasn't been confirmed, this meeting, but nor has it really been categorically denied either. What's your reading of the situation?
Well, according to my information here on the ground in Yerevan, it has been the Azerbaijani side that has been dragging its feet. Russia and Armenia have been both willing and perhaps more anxious to solidify a preliminary agreement. And what's interesting is what I do know. The one area of progress in terms of diplomatic negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan has been this tripartite working group on trade and transport. What's interesting is for this agreement, the current position is much more favorable to Armenia. In other words, Azerbaijan has de escalated its demands for a so called Sunnik corridor. And according to the agreement, it is a road and railway link between Armenia and Azerbaijan along the border between Armenia and Iran and not directly cutting through or cutting off any territory of Armenia. Second, Armenia's sovereignty and independence is not challenged by this agreement, and there is no comparable context with the Lachin corridor. And much of these road and railway links will be policed, enforced, and guaranteed by Russian border guards and Russian personnel. which raises other questions of how much Armenia is mortgaging its independence and sovereignty to Russia in this post war environment. But I do think we should see similar agreements coming in terms of border demarcation. And there has to be a legal institutional framework and foundation here in terms of this issue. And finally, the pressing, urgent priority for the Armenian government is the full and complete return of all prisoners of war and civilian hostages from Azerbaijani captivity. Azerbaijan to date has delayed, deferred, and has used the prisoners as leverage in a transactional arrangement seeking to garner concessions from the Pashinyan government. And I do hope that with the pending agreement, once announced and signed, there will be a full and complete return of the prisoners.
Yeah, you mentioned the border demarcation. Putin recently came out saying that it will be based on 1920s Soviet era maps, but there would be give and take rather, depending on, I guess, various infrastructure issues on the border lines. I guess this is what I'm assuming. And with regards to the unblocking of communications, I think the use of the term corridor just confused a lot of people or kind of confirmed the fears that they
Yes.
might already have had. One of the things that I heard, I don't know if it's true or not, but I'm just asking if you believe this was one of the obstacles, is what exactly constitutes unimpeded, the word that, well, it's the translated word that is used in the ceasefire agreement. Some people were saying that it was disagreement about who gets to do customs or border checks and so on and so forth. Were those the issues, or were there others that have kind of obstructed things?
Actually, both. In many ways, it was the Azerbaijani side that was playing with semantics, if you will, and inferring meanings that weren't necessarily logical nor legally applicable. But I do think there was a challenge in the details, in the practical elements of Armenia's position as a Eurasian Economic Union member, as well as customs inspection for cargo, for example. The other aspect here is the link from Azerbaijan to Nakhchivan may actually be a roadway and railway from point to point with no exit in Armenia proper. And the other sticking point was the specific financial amount of Armenia's transit fees for the tons of cargo or passengers in terms of using both connections. But what's important, going back to border demarcation that you raised, President Putin of Russia recently announced yes, they'll be uh, proposing a reference point of a Soviet period map. What's interesting is Russia, in my opinion, was very complicit and was exploiting border insecurity and incursions by failing at any earlier point to propose a reference point. In other words, Armenia and Azerbaijan have been using different Soviet maps of different eras, different periods, and even different scales of the maps. Russia, in this working group until now, has failed to offer a compromise or concession. And I think it was on purpose to exploit the insecurity. Hence, the Russian military buildup, for example, in southern Armenia, and Russia's very quiet acquisition of Armenia's third external border in terms of Russia will take over control of the Armenian Azerbaijani border, in addition to the Armenian Turkish and Armenian Iranian borders, which raises new questions over Armenian sovereignty.
Hmm. Yes, indeed. Let's go on to Karabakh itself. One of the things that the border dispute, let's call it, has succeeded in doing is taking the focus off Karabakh, and so now this is very much being looked at what's happening on the Armenia-Azerbaijan border, and people have kind of forgotten about Nagorno Karabakh in a sense. Aliyev says, there's absolutely no question of status anymore. Others, such as Liberidian, have been pushing for effectively, that maybe some kind of non-territorial cultural autonomy. The OSCE Minsk Group and various powers, such as the US, I guess, have said that no status is something. Russia wants it left to the future. But it doesn't strike me that there's a lot of time to resolve these issues. I know many people say that, the Russians, when they go somewhere, they never leave. But, this is kind of a gamble to assume that they're not going to leave. And a lot of progress has got to be reached in 2025 and definitely by 2030, don't you think? How do you assess the situation and what do you foresee as necessary steps on this matter?
Well, not only do I agree with you, I would go even further. In other words, the physical safety, security, and the daily lives of the Armenians of Nagorno Karabakh do not have the luxury of waiting for 4 years of Russian peacekeepers. It's a much more immediate, pressing challenge. And on the one hand, I am worried because one likely scenario regarding Nagorno Karabakh is the Abkhazia model of Nagorno Karabakh increasingly becoming little more than a Russian garrison state, and even perhaps with the distribution of Russian passports in the future. Hence, much of the Armenian focus from Stepanakert is looking to Moscow and not to Yerevan. What we also see, it does seem diplomatically that all parties, Armenia included, have agreed to defer the status issue to some abstract future date. And while Azerbaijan's so called offer of autonomy is not treated seriously by anyone and not taken seriously, I do think the interim status, the interim de facto situation on the ground is an immediate pressing challenge where we don't have the luxury to wait until the end of the deadline of Russian peacekeepers. At the same time, an interesting aspect here, if we look in the medium to long term, the outlook for stability in the region, Armenia has passed a crucial test against the government and against the country. It is Azerbaijan that is much more at risk. And the future of Nagorno Karabakh may increasingly depend on the outlook for the Aliyev regime. In other words, for Aliyev and Baku, this was not enough of a military victory, nor enough of a diplomatic victory. And without the justification of the conflict in terms of family corruption, a lack of democracy, he's riding a tiger. And it is going to be precarious for the Azerbaijani leadership going forward in the coming years. And that may be the wild card.
I suppose a kind of related question is what will the domestic reaction be in Armenia to any process of normalization with either or both neighbors? And I think we're even seeing a clear divergence of opinion in Armenia-Karabakh and the diasporas, and I refer to the plural in the last case. And Pashinyan seemed to do quite poorly in the recent local elections. Are we seeing the emergence of discontent about what's happening now between Azerbaijan and Armenia?
Unfortunately, no. I say unfortunately because the lack of public debate, the lack of a more elevated discourse is a fundamental problem in terms of a critically important issue of national importance being neglected or being in some ways distorted. The strength of the Pashinyan government in terms of resiliency is not because of the free and fair elections. It's because there is no alternative right now to Prime Minister Pashinyan. The opposition, in my opinion, remains discredited, deeply unpopular, and has failed to present an alternative policy or idea. Nevertheless, regarding Armenia Turkey normalization, after Turkey's unprecedented support for Azerbaijan in the war, emotionally it's going to be difficult to embrace normalization anytime soon. It has to be part of a bigger package of benefits for Armenia, including perhaps the promise of railway, road, and gas links to Russia through Azerbaijan. But at the same time, politically, the discourse in Armenia is distressingly primitive, crude, and I criticize both the government for arrogance and complacency, but I also criticize the opposition parties for actually failing to explain what they will do differently.
So these economic links are obviously a crucial part of the jigsaw puzzle that seems to be being played with at the moment. But I also remember when you've spoken about normalization before, you've also made a point that normalization does not necessarily mean reconciliation. And so, whatever way this goes, it is going to be a long process, in my opinion. Anyway, I don't think there's a solution overnight. There hasn't been for 30 years. Why would one suddenly emerge now? But just to end, at least from my part, I'll give you also the space to add anything you want at the end. But if you could advise the Armenian government now, and actually even if you could advise the Azerbaijani government now, what, as we approach the first anniversary of the end of last year's war, or at least the ceasefire agreement, what would your recommendations to them be?
Well, I would recommend the basic minimum. In other words, for the Azerbaijani side, I think the burden, the challenge, and the imperative is to fulfill and implement the terms of the Russian imposed ceasefire to a fuller extent. In other words, the complete return of the prisoners of war and civilian hostages will go a long way to turning the page and to actually go beyond the emotional and, I should say, urgent context of the post war situation. At the same time, what's interesting here is both Armenia, Turkey, and Armenia, Azerbaijan, Nagorno Karabakh, economics and trade have never been important incentives until now. And a lot of it is the timing. The challenge of economic recovery from COVID 19 and the need for an adjusted network of supply chains will offer Armenia an important way to emerge as a true transit state. And in many ways, the real loser in trade and transportation is Georgia. Hence, much of the Russian motivation is to isolate and marginalize Georgia. This is why recently Georgia's facilitation between Armenia and Azerbaijan has been a very adequate and good response to the threat of isolation to Georgia. But going forward, I think both of us, as students of history, but also as analysts covering the region, I do think we are in a new unprecedented period that is, of course, a deep seated challenge, but also one that is pregnant with opportunity. And again, one lesson from the war: Armenia, we thought we were the Israel of the Caucasus, yet in reality, we became the Palestinians in terms of weakness and asymmetry. And I do want to avoid a repeat of Armenia becoming the Palestinians in never missing an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And I do think we have to challenge and expect more from our leaders in Armenia.
Would there be anything else that you would like to add, or?
Well, the important thing is to close on a more optimistic note going forward with two observations. One is militarily, as bad as the war was, it could have been much worse. And in this context, Armenia and Nagorno Karabakh are essentially nothing but a nation of survivors. And I do think we've passed a crucial test of survival and resiliency that Azerbaijan does not have going forward. The second observation is we are too small to fail in terms of gains and success and achievements in Armenia. It doesn't require much and it doesn't require many. And I do think that we can seize our own future in terms of greater self sufficiency and no longer looking to either Russia or the West primarily.
Okay, so thank you very much for your time, Richard. I mean, we could actually speak for hours on this, but I think, yeah, we really could. But anyway, I look forward to reading and hearing more from you. I think we're now at a very interesting point. I guess this is a chance to rewind the clock and hopefully not to make the mistakes of the past. But it is the South Caucasus.
Exactly. And I hope to see you in Tbilisi once we begin opening up more.
Great, Richard. Thanks very much.
Thanks again for the opportunity, Onik.